I think every panel should have someone arrive like that. Patrick. Now, Patrick has had his wonderful scooter. So they did something terrible to it, didn't they? They squashed it. Yes, it's on.
They put it through oversized baggage, which was, they should have given it to me on the air bridge, but there was a thunderstorm at Sydney Airport, so there was no one on the tarmac, and they thought, what do you do with it? Put it through oversized baggage, and you can see that footrest there, and they broke the electrics. They basically didn't make it quite what it should be. But it's all, I hope, in hand.
So, Patrick, just tell us who you are, apart from about Virgin and wrecking your scooter.
I'm a service user. I've got progressive multiple sclerosis. I'm medically retired. I first got the disease in 1972. I was diagnosed in 1995, and I retired in 2012. I now run a website to keep the grey matter active. I'm a service user, so I talk to nurses about long-term conditions, what it's like to suffer from long-term conditions, and I'm also on a few advisory boards to help them with dealing with service users, I suppose, at the end of the day. PPI, I'm making the connection between the consultants who are designing these drugs and these preventative diseases, and the patients, and how well the patients will take them, or to help them to design decent documents that are readable and not 2 pages of highly packed text.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Krueger, tell us who you are and why you're here.
Hello?
It's here. It should be on.
Does it work?
Yeah. Yes.
So my name is Gunnar Krueger, and I'm from Siemens Healthineers. I'm in charge of collaboration, scientific collaboration, and collaboration partner in a region which we call EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So in this responsibility, I'm in close contact with a lot of our research partners, and also act as an interface to the pre-development in the company. So I'm coming out of a very strong imaging background, and I mention this because that's also my motivation here to be today here. I think the topics that are being discussed, data access, data integration, and so on, are extremely important, and so I hope that I also can contribute here in this discussion a little bit with my imaging background and my knowledge in the field of collaboration between different, in this case, mostly academic and industrial partnerships.
Philippe.
I'm Philippe Amouyel. I'm a professor of epidemiology and public health and specialize in genomics of Alzheimer's. I work for now more than 10 years on GWAS for Alzheimer's, sorting out all the different lossy for susceptibility, and I have another function, which is that I'm chairing a large collaborative initiative which has been initiated by member states in Europe, which is called Joint Programming Initiative for Neurodegenerative Disease Research, better known under the acronym GPND, where we try to make 30 different countries, including non-European countries, just like Canada and Australia, to work together, to put money together in a virtual pot, and to organize transnational collaborations with very high level of funding for each of the retained application.
Rebecca.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Fuller, CHDI Foundation, and I'm Director of Clinical Outcomes. CHDI is a foundation that's dedicated to providing the research community the correct tools to enable research in Huntington's disease. We work on one indication, and that's Huntington's disease. As far as clinical outcomes, we are a unit dedicated to providing assessments, and both in the traditional space and in the technological space, in order to provide endpoints for these compounds that are coming to fruition through clinical trials now for Huntington's disease. Because as you all know, right now there is not a treatment for the disorder.
Okay, now Luke, tell us who you are, but also you're going to start us off, as it were, with an introduction, which either you can do there or you can do from the podium, whichever you'd like.
I can do it from here, it's fine. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Truyen. I work for Janssen. I'm the head of development neuroscience, but I have a second hat, actually like most people here, that I also oversee external affairs, which is coordinating all the public-private partnerships and other ones we engage in. In that position, I've been fortunate enough to be, well, call it birth father of several very nice projects, IMI EPAD, Global Alzheimer's Platform, and the Dementia Discovery Fund, where I was yesterday, which is why I missed the scientific posters and most of the day today, for which I'm sorry, and I'm sure it was my miss. And I'm very much interested in collaboration and data sharing. Those words have been used already, and I hope we can further, in this space, talk about what that actually means, because I think there's several societal and cultural hurdles that this room can't solve, but that we need to call out. So, should I start?
Yes,
okay.
Do start. Either up there or there. You're going to
okay. So, the use of technology actually can be applied and valuable across the whole patient journey. So, Patrick, I mean, I hope you can support some of what I'll be saying. But
yes.
Good start. So, if we, on the next slide, if we kind of put big blocks around, oh, yes, sorry. I don't work for IMI, but still for a company, so I have to say that what I say is only in personal name. Next slide. Thank you very much. So, in neuroscience, if you talk that in particular, clearly there's a huge unmet need. If you think about the diseases we can materially affect, there's not many. We can provide relief for some aspects of it. In MS, for example, Patrick, we can address the inflammatory component, but not the neurodegenerative one yet. So we solve part of the problem. So big unmet need. So how can we find new treatments? There's also, well, we talk about lack of awareness and advocacy. I think it's actually more about unwillingness to be aware about many of these diseases because of the stigma they carry. And that goes when we talk about societal issues later. Underdiagnosis, people just don't present until late for most of these diseases. Care, treatment is another area where there is inadequate coverage. If you think about how care delivery in dementia is happening today, that is woefully inadequate. Relapses of diseases, we can, and schizophrenia is an example, but MS is another example where, again, we can treat an acute event, but we are very bad at predicting when the next one will come so we can act properly. I talked about care already and stigma and adherence. Martin in the prior panel already mentioned that technological tools there could really help us to assure that people take the treatment they require. So this is kind of the patient journey arc, as I call it, and there's many things that are already happening today here that touch upon this. But my underlying theme will be, it's a bit like a cottage industry. So many people are doing small things and see value in what they do, but the real value isn't realized because it's been developed in one country, not another, it's not used in one country, not another. So I think a theme and where IMI can play a role is bringing some of that together. We already talked about, diagnosis, imaging has come up, but are there other things, and that's where digital can come in, that gives us an earlier read on saying, oh, something is not going quite right. And we have some examples already in PRISM and IMI project where withdrawal from social contacts, could that be a warning sign? We can measure that today. I mean, what people put online on Facebook, etc., and then stop doing it could actually be an alarm signal. So it's just the willingness to look at all those data sources and being able then with big data to bring them together. So I guess the bottom line is there's a lot happening. IMI actually has several projects that go, and we can talk about RADAR, RADAR-CNS, RADAR-AD. You participate in RADAR?
Yes.
Right, so but again, how can we bring that all more together so that it really starts making a difference once we deploy new treatments? So that was kind of the setup I wanted to give.
Okay, very good. So let's now think, I mean, you've outlined very well there why new technology is so important in neurological disease. I mean, just let me follow up with a question. Where do you see the areas of technology convergence that will be the most disruptive in this field?
My personal view here is early detection. I think if we think about how late we actually, I'll talk about one of my main focus field, Alzheimer's, at what stage we actually get these people and diagnose them, we're probably already talking about mid to end stage of disease, of a process that starts much earlier. Are there ways in the diagnostic funnel where gaming can come in and your ability to learn new stuff that is captured, which is what Lumosity has tried to do, but where also, oh, that was another slide I had, where See Hero Quest, it's a game, right, that you can buy on the iTunes store. But it will track your ability for spatial navigation. We know that in Alzheimer's could be a very early sign. So using our technologies that we all carry in that way, I think would be the most impactful.
But it's also on with something like Sequest is then how do you capture people who've done Sequest then to make sure that they get into the system?
So that's where the societal and cultural aspects come in. On the one hand, we're all worried about privacy. On the other hand, I was just traveling with somebody whose wife just posted on Facebook that she's going to have a baby in May, and he didn't even know.
Presumably it was his baby. Just asking.
We didn't travel long enough together to find that out. But again, I mean, so we have this dual approach to this. So one easy way to do is they're saying, if I'm going to play Sequest, I will agree that part of this data goes to some central repository that somehow gets hooked up with your GP, or if your ability to play this game or learn a new one goes down, he gets a red flag and saying the next healthcare visit, let's talk about this.
I think I should go. I couldn't even work the controls.
Baseline is important.
The baseline is important. Okay, so let's come to you now, Rebecca. Where do you see the areas that could be most disruptive in your particular field?
Well, we have a number of paper and pencil and traditional assessments for Huntington's disease, and these mostly start at the time of manifestation. That's when the motor symptoms are severe enough to be firmly diagnosed as someone having Huntington's disease. However, we also have the gene. So we know who has the gene and is gene positive for Huntington's disease. And what we need to do is to move our assessments to the pre-manifest state, to the state where individuals are still working, they are busy with their lives, they have the gene, but they don't have the symptoms that are disrupting their life. However, at that point, there are still some symptoms. There are some cognitive, behavioral, and other very minor symptoms that we need to measure. We need to measure those now. And we have the technology, but we don't have the regulatory acceptance of these.
So what technology is that?
Well, sensors, tremors, holding the phone in your hand, because you can measure passive measurement of tremor in the hand with the phone. And we could implement these today, and they could be potentially endpoints for treatments that are coming through the pipeline. However, we need regulatory acceptance for these. So we need two things, really. We need, first of all, regulatory acceptance, and we're happy to talk to you about how to do that. And then there's also the sort of convergent validity, and that these new technologies need to be compared to the gold standard. And the gold standard is a paper and pencil test with a clinician or a patient-reported outcome. And we need, as a community, to decide how do we measure that validity when you're not going to have a direct comparison between the old measurement and the new measurement.
How about you, Patrick? What do you think about that? Because you were talking about, I think you said in 1972 was when you first had symptoms, but presumably they weren't recognized as such.
I didn't know it was MS, but I think in this day and age, it's more and more about education, education, education. You actually need to make people aware that they could have it.
Okay,
I mean, in those
but
days, it wasn't talked about, it wasn't known.
Okay, but is there a technology that you think could be helpful in that early diagnosis?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are ways in which you can test for the presence of multiple sclerosis, and the ways that you can test for the presence, I suspect, of lots and lots and lots of diseases. It's, there is something wrong with mine, and the doctor can then refer you to the right person, and once you get down the line, they can quick diagnosis, whereas before it took months and months. And I'm sure the same goes with Huntington's and other diseases. You can identify them quickly, but it's education, education.
Okay. Gunnar, what about the challenges in this field? Where do you see the challenges?
Maybe I briefly come back to the previous question, because in the discussion today, one point is a little bit, was so far a little bit missing, and maybe I briefly mention it. So if you speak about technology developments, there are a lot of new technologies out there, and then coming from the imaging perspective, I mean, it starts at very, very simple aspects like standardization, like quality control of the methods that we apply. It goes then to quantification of the results. So, I mean, if we do a blood test, we are all used to, or it's clear to everybody there is some quantitative number coming out and a range for normative ranges, and it's very easy then to see this is out of range and something should follow up. In an imaging space, we are moving more and more also in this direction, and now putting this together, this can have enormous impact on the patient management. I mean, we already mentioned early detection is one field, but the patient management is also a very important aspect. So here, new technologies are, for example, clinical decision support infrastructures. So IT infrastructures that really enable to integrate the data. That's from what we see in terms of patient management is a huge step forward. So now you asked for the challenges. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of challenges, and there are technology challenges and other groups. I mean, let's briefly start perhaps thinking about technology challenges. I mean, again, coming from the imaging perspective, we have to deal, and this holds true also for many other areas. We have to deal with more and more data. So nowadays, if a patient goes into an imaging scanner, there are easily hundreds, if not thousands, images generated, and all this needs to be read by physicians, by radiologists, for example, and being interpreted. So there's a huge challenge in order to support, in this case, in the first place, the radiologist in dealing with all the images, and that's where, for example, new algorithms, machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence, we spoke about this today many times already, really comes into the place to really support here the work of the physician, not taking over, but supporting and getting most and the best information out of the data. And
so you mean something like DeepMind Health's the retinal scan?
Not even. I mean, it can be very simple things, but make it more robust, make it readily accessible. Looking to a radiologist, again, I mean, he has to flip through many images. Very likely that you oversee something. Think of smart algorithms that help this physician to guide to things where he should look at. And but developing these, I mean, here we are again at the need of data. And so I think this is a clear challenge. I mean, right now, a lot of institutions, a lot of industry is building up expertise. Everybody has data, but I mean, one could do an exercise and think of what could we do and where could we stay in 1 year, 2 years instead of 5 years if we had, let's say, unlimited access to data. So to continue, if you think in terms of clinical decision support infrastructure, so IT infrastructure that brings together, that integrates the data And the physician who has to make the decision, he wants to have all the information from imaging, from genetics, from clinical testing, from pathology. He wants to have everything readily together. And these IT infrastructures promise to do this. The problem here, and this is another challenge, the data in the hospitals, they come out of different departments, for example. And it's apparently, it sounds silly, but it's from a technology very difficult task to really manage to bring all these things together. Other aspects, if we come with new technologies, also what is the clinical acceptance? So the physicians, they suddenly get new tools. How can they have to trust this, and they have to have education on this. So here's another challenge. And then, of course, I mean, if we think from the industrial point of view, introducing new technology means somebody also has to pay for this. So it costs the development, and of course, I mean, this is, at some point is turned onto the customer. So who's the customer? And if there are no reimbursement schemes covering this, then of course, I mean, this creates additional challenges of having potentially new technology available that can make fantastic things, but nobody who is able to afford it, or nobody who feels responsible to afford it. So there's a bunch of...
Yes, and another point in that, Gunnar, is the old batteries not included phenomenon. In other words, that you develop a technology which is actually not very expensive. I'm thinking printers and printer inks. So, you know, the technology, the printer is the cheapest bit, but the inks are gold. And we've seen in the past a lot of legacy systems where it's become too expensive for people to afford to keep them up, and we need to make sure that we don't go into that space again.
I mean, that's a very critical point, and I mean, that's where also, in my opinion, the community and also organizations like IMI come into role to think of ways to enable some of these things. Over lunch, we had a discussion with respect to data access, and coming up with some more, let's say, generalized rules of how this can be made easier in order to support, for example, algorithmic work. Just missed my...
Let's move on to Philippe. So, Philippe, where do you see the main challenges?
In the field of research, I think from my point of view, the main challenge is the use and the introduction of all these new technologies to generate new disruptive hypotheses. We need that desperately because we have such a large amount of data. We spoke about digitalization of imaging in preclinical, in basic research, in cells and whatever. This makes a lot of information that we don't have enough time to analyze. So we need to have some education of the researchers to use these techniques. First, education of the physician, then to use them after when they will be available, because we are far in advance there. And the third point is to convince academy also to invest in that type of technology. The process of investment in academical projects are very variable according to the different university, very classical in general. We're just speaking about biology, not necessarily about IT. There's a question also of the bioinformaticians, because you need a lot of people like this in each team just to be able to multiply this and to generate new hypotheses.
And again, there's a huge shortage of bioinformaticians.
Exactly. And the second point I would like to mention is, for example, the challenge that was proposed by Luc about early diagnosis. And you mentioned about the sequence privacy of your data. You should consider that it will be very different if we have a treatment or treatments or not. First, we are in a research phase, clinical research phase, so it's very difficult. It's a lot of conditions about the privacy of data. But when you will have a treatment, that there is a solution, what will be the most important is to make the diagnosis as early as possible. And we clearly know that, now we know that some neurological test, neuropsychological test, shows up 10 or 12 years before the usual thresholds which are used in diagnosis. So you have very minor and low signals in a large wealth of your daily data, that the way you use your mobile phone, the way you play to sequence, the way you phone to your friends, and so on. It will be for you very useful to give an open view to this to your physicians, for him to help him to make a diagnosis very early and to treat you as soon as possible.
But let me just go back to Patrick on this. So Patrick, one of the issues about multiple sclerosis is sometimes if people go to a GP, but they're very reluctant to put a diagnosis of MS in the notes because it could not be MS. So they may put query MS, but even that raises huge issues for patients in terms of insurance and other things. And so how do you feel about the use of data in this way? And because it's a tricky one.
I don't have any very strong feelings about it because, I mean, I've had MS for such a long time and I was diagnosed in 1995. I think with the development of drugs now, a lot of the black marks that are put against someone with MS can now be really removed because you can actually stop progression and shortly they're going to be able to go steps further. So it's got to become a more, to my mind, a more socially acceptable disease and not something in which you're black marked and labelled as disabled and you can't do things. The world has moved on and we've got to accept and we've got to live with it and realise that it can be stopped as you can stop other illnesses. Just because someone's had cancer doesn't stop their life, does it? They still carry on and they carry on at work. I could have worked, I could still be doing a part-time job, but I haven't got the energy. And so people have got to grow up and live with it, and it's a complete society cultural change that needs to be done with long-term conditions of any type or sort.
So there's a societal, yes.
If I could maybe, I mean, because you bring the MS and the diagnosis to your point, talk about impact of technology. The first treatment for MS was approved on one MRI scan. The one MRI scan tied together the pathology with what they thought the treatment could affect, in other words, inflammatory lesions, and that unfortunately, and this is the need for patient engagement, the subject died shortly after that MRI scan, so they could look at the brain. And that tied for the regulators together that the hypothesis of these new lesions in MS that we pick up on this new high-tech tool are actually the inflammatory lesions. And so Don Petty, Paul Lieber at the time, they approved the first drug. Then tied back to the point that Philippe was making, the diagnostic rate of MS. In other words, the number of people that then jumped up because all of a sudden there was less qualms about not calling it because I couldn't do anything. There was a treatment available. So that clearly is a dynamic we need to acknowledge with many neurological diseases.
So clearly the idea of this privacy of data and diagnosis that could alter your insurances, taxes, and so on is really related to the treatment that does exist. The example of giving your private data is just for a screening, to screen you as soon as possible, to treat you, to eliminate the risk, and to reduce your insurance, okay? Different if I use that in general, not in a clinical research context at all. And for example, the family genomics is terrible for that because people are not aware when they are young that this may be used afterwards with other purpose. That's a problem. The first things I say to all my students who go to this genomics, they say, okay, the first thing you will know is that maybe your father is not your father. This will be terrible for your life. It's not a disease, but it's a psychological problem. So the idea is that if you eliminate the risk with this information, it's interesting. If you flag somebody because of clinical research, it's useful for research to make things advance, but it should not be disclosed. And when people say, okay, I need to know, I think it's a very, very bad idea.
I think there's got to be a difference between...
Do you need to put this closer?
Sorry, I think there needs to be a difference between disclosing something medically to other medical people that they need to know about it, because a lot of medical treatment is multidisciplinary, and actually putting it out into the wide open world. And I think that is another question which I think society has got to address at some point or another, because you've got to tell other people in the medical world, I've got MS, because they need to know the way they treat me, but does my insurance company need to know? It's up to me to tell them, so it's very difficult.
And maybe this is off the point completely now, but maybe we need to think about insurance. As we move forward into these new technologies, we have to think about insurance in another way. We have to think about rewarding people with lower insurances for taking some of these diagnostic tests, rather than penalizing them for taking diagnostic tests.
Yeah, but the problem is that if you push the reasoning at its maximum, you will identify people who are at no risk and people who are at high risk. And when I'm no risk, should I have to make any insurances? So this kill out totally the economical model of insurances, or everybody pay with no risk to save some people's who are at very high risk. So we should be careful about that.
Yes.
And insurances should be careful about that also.
Yes, okay, so we're getting off the point with insurance, but Luke, let's start with you. How should we move forward, and what paths should be further developed into core topics, in your view?
Well, the digital SDG, maybe that's the last slide that I had, has set up a program to say, okay, what are the things, I don't know if we can go back to my slides, but that was, what are the things we need to look at? And that could be building on existing projects, so expand on RADAR, how to take that into a qualification procedure, for example, anything that comes out of there. PRISM 2 is something that's definitely something that we want to do. Here they are. So the digital health SDG, I don't think to this audience I need to say what an SDG is, has these as their priorities. So digital diagnostics, as I said, early detection, can gaming help us, for example. Predicting relapses. So I already talked about this. We are, and I'll make 2 points here. Radar is something like that. Is there some remote sensing that starts to indicate, oh, the walk speed is going down, or there's a fall, or that's where the new Apple Watch can also help with its fall detection, for example. Or something, and I make this point, internally we're looking with Vibov in a study called Orbit at can we predict relapses in depression, which is great because we have a mood portfolio. The issue I have with that is we are again doing it within confines of our company rather than thinking how can we do this more broadly so that everybody doesn't have to invent the wheel. And I think that's another aspect IMI can really be a lever for, is saying the differentiation for patients should be on the outcomes you generate, not on the tools you use to measure that. It should be the quality of the molecules. And I think they're working together, you could actually get there much faster. A point that was made earlier, I think, Saladin, you made it about, if you do it sequentially, you're like 20 years going. So I'm not going to read all the points, but so there's a clear plan we want to expand actually on that patient journey and pick up pieces, early diagnosis, relapse monitoring, and then drug adherence again, because that's one of the biggest reasons for treatment failure is the drug is not taken. We all know this in this room. It's just not systematically addressed.
Okay, but that's not just not a technology issue. There are all sorts of beliefs and cultural values about medicines, which is behind why people don't take them.
That is true, but at least if you can show an accurate measure and confront people with it, then you create a bit of a guilt cycle, right? So it does help.
Guilt cycle ever help you? Rebecca?
I think the most important part is the sharing of data. I think anyone running any clinical trial, especially in any CNS, it'd be wonderful if they can use a technological endpoint or assessment, even if it's not a primary or secondary endpoint, even if it's not exploratory, just add it in so that there's data, and then that data can be shared. So as we move forward, in order to use these as endpoints for all CNS disorders. And in addition, I think it's really important that after the data is shared, there's analysis and guidelines published on how to use this data successfully.
And actually, there's a good question there from on Slido, is could IMI extend funding for completed projects that could be extended to enable scalability and sustainability? And that's presumably something you'd absolutely endorse.
Oh, yes, certainly. That'd be excellent.
Me too.
Yeah. Philippe, how about you? What calls do you think should be developed in this particular area using these new technologies?
I think, as Rebecca said, I think data sharing is essential because we need this large volume of data to get small signals and find totally on agnostic basis, because in neuroscience most of the things are phenomenological, that you observe and you work on what you observed and you are concentrated on what you observe. There it enlarges totally your visions. Sharing data in the academic field but also in the private field, that merging both of data, because they don't give exactly the same type of information, so that's important. The second point, which is important, I think, is because we are dealing with technology that are capturing almost continuously information of your private life, I think in all the group, in all the board, we should have patience, because we need first to ask them if they consider and their opinion on that. We have the example that in the World Dementia Council, or UKIS, we have 3 patients, and their view are totally different from time to time from the view of the researchers, and they bring new things, because when you're researchers, you are not patients, you probably not see the evolution and the research the same way, because you are not really concerned by the disease. So I think it's very important to have more and more patients that can help us as scientists to make progress. And last point is, through GP&D collaboration, which is really academic, if we could increase our interaction with IMI, I would be very pleased about that.
And we do need to recognize, of course, we talk about patients as if they were, a homogeneous group, and of course they're not. They're as different as everyone else in this room with different views. Gunnar, where would you like to see calls developed?
Well, I very much agree with the other 3 panelists here, so it's kind of hard to add something. So I totally also support, the data is an extremely important issue, and one thing perhaps to throw in here in the thinking is whether there could be also a component of making a little bit of marketing in the community to be open for providing their own data into a system. And of course, a lot of challenges there with privacy and so on, clear. But I think changing, so in the community, in the mind of the people, in particular in certain countries, there is clearly a strong resistance to think about giving data into such research projects or projects that potentially can be used for further development. And of course, there's the worry that my data can be misused. So if we manage to get this under control and working then in parallel perhaps on, let's call it a marketing strategy to create awareness in the community that if you as an individual provide your data into the system and you don't have a personal risk on this, but if you do so, and if 10 million, 20 million, 100 million other people in your country are doing the same thing, we suddenly can increase the speed of development enormously. So I don't know from which angle best to touch, but maybe a thought.
So Patrick, what do you feel about this? About, we've had calls from all the other panelists about the need to share data. How do you feel about the sharing of data? You went into the RADAR-CNS study. That will have involved sharing of data. And what sort of considerations did you have before you agreed to take part?
I think it was more a case of, did I want to take part in the study? Because any study you get involved in, you're going to have to share data. That's a fact of life. So that, what was of greater consolation, consolation is the wrong word, relief to me, was actually being able to contribute to it as a service user. And I think that's much, much as important as all the other areas that you've talked about today. But I think actually, I am the customer. You're all developing drugs and abilities for me to lead a better quality of life. For me, I am the customer. And at the end of the day, you've got to get something for me that I am going to use. It's no good.
So data is a fair trade-off?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's a fair trade-off. If I can avoid going into hospital every 2 weeks for some sort of injection by taking an oral pill, then I've won. And I'm the customer. So kind of that's the way I look at things. And you're only going to find that out by talking to service users who can actually voice their reluctance to go trudging 40 miles twice a week or every 2 weeks into hospital.
Okay.
So kind of that's my take on all of this. And there hasn't been a great emphasis placed upon service users. And I think if IMI can really do something, it will be to encourage the subsidiary companies to make sure they involve users in their drug developments.
Okay, so there's a good question there that's come in. How we support end users to interpret the multitude of data to be collected for prevention. You know, there is a real issue here with neurological disease in particular about, you know, how we interpret that data. I mean, so for instance, you were talking about scan data. So the DeepMind Health project that's looking at retinal scans is there for the detection of macular degeneration, but the optic nerve is the, you know, the entry to the gateway to the brain, as it were. I mean, it might well discover in a while that there are things that indicate Alzheimer's or other serious neurological disease. How do you sort out the ethics of that, and how can IMI, you know, play a part in helping you ensure that those elements are part of some of the challenges?
Can I take a first shot, maybe, and then Philippe? So the scenario you paint about an incidental finding, there's a good framework for it. I think then it's just contacting the GP. You went in for an eye scan and you found a lesion. That I think is pretty well worked out.
But it has to be very well validated first before you. So with artificial intelligence, you know, you develop an algorithm for one thing,
Yes.
which is regulated, and then it finds a whole other thing. How much, you know, how far do you have to go down the line before you're...
I don't think the way things are going is not like this. You have a new apparatus, and then some specialists take it and use it, and everybody published, and you can use it for macular degenerescence, you can use it for Alzheimer's, you can use it for diabetes, and so on. So that's typically the situation of incidental finding we have from all scanning images for years and years now, where you found a tumor somewhere or something which looked like a tumor, and and the person came for something totally different. So I think there's already some experience in the fields about that, definitely.
Okay.
But this actually talks about the more systematic collection and finding a different peak than the original one where you were mining the data for. And that, I think, the only way is, again, collaboration to really first find out, is that a reproducible thing? Because, you know, typically we want to validate it from one data set to another. Again, going back to the willingness to data share. And then once we both agree, the parties involved, that it is real, then we have to find a way to communicate back.
Data sharing has two advantages in epistemology, that if you open your data, everybody can verify, so all the question of scientific integrity is in already, automatically, and you have peer and other things like that. And the second point is that there is replication by independent teams. This is at least two good reasons to share data for epistemology and research in general. Excuse me.
No, I would also like to say that in order to share the data, it's important to have standards for the data collection.
Yeah.
So the data is collected, stored, and I don't know, even the same variable names, whatever. But there's a systematic approach to collecting the data so that it can be shared later down the line. And I think we could establish those standards early.
And we haven't even got to talking about storage, which is a whole other issue.
I think the storage is not the problem. The problem is exactly what you said, that is to have some interoperability of the data and discussion within the data, and that takes a lot of time, because it's not just to put data, it's to put data, to clean up the data, to validate the data, and then you put it on.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, carry on.
I think there's something else to be considered. I mean, is that data going to have a life-changing effect upon the patient? And is the patient actually going to be able to understand the information that the clinician is going to give to him or her?
Is the clinician going to understand the data?
As well,
yes.
yes.
Because there's quite an issue, I mean, certainly in genomics, with whether the clinician understands the data.
Yep.
So there's, yes. Okay, there's a whole new can of worms we've opened off here. Any questions before we close this? I think that's Sam from Asthma UK. Sam.
Thank you. Just to pick up on that last point, I think the idea of sharing data across countries and borders and data sets is incredibly important, and I think your point about making sure that you've got data standards in place. We've been looking at collaborating on a severe asthma data set with the US, but the problem seems to be is not the technology or the data standards, it's agreeing what severe asthma looks like. And you would think severe asthma would be something that everybody knows what severe asthma is, but actually what's clear is around the world, everybody's defining it completely differently. So we have to think about ways of helping people to get to a point where they can agree at least the clinical definitions before you can even start to get to a point where you can get those data standards. And I think that's going to be as much of the challenge as the technology.
Can I just add to that point, because for regulatory, I mean, this is across several diseases actually a problem. Treatment-resistant depression, you would say the name says treatment-resistant, but agreeing on what that actually means, how many, for how long, etc., is simply not aligned. So that creates difficulties, not just to get approval, but to get shared data across. And
that's a great question that's just popped up. Who's asked that about data standards? That's a very nice question. Data standards evolve by definition. Can we create an evolutive model to make incremental progress? Philippe?
Yeah, this is totally possible. That's what we are doing, because just for instance in cardiovascular disease, the definition of where is a heart attack has evolved during the last 20 years because of new diagnoses, new enzyme, new things like that. So everything evolved, and we can keep the continuity from the beginning and keep the information. This is what I related to cleanup of data, to quality of data, to reference, and to standards. So we do that every day because things are changing.
Corinne, the last word to you.
Thank you. This session on the neurological disorders and the previous one on tox reminded me of another thing that I would like to, if you give me back that magic wand, ask IMI and the people that are working on this. So one of the frustrations I find is that medicine exposure data and all sorts of outcome data in hospitals is much less available and much less connected than out in primary care systems. And with the innovative medicines that are being developed and with people living longer, actually what you have is you need to follow up people for much longer, and people are chopping and changing therapies, for instance, in treatment-resistant depression, in Parkinson's, in MS. So actually, would it be worth investing in especially in hospital systems, but also that then connect to the outpatients or even healthy people environment? And I know that that's what we've been talking about, but it hasn't actually been specified that in the long run, even if there's no immediate commercial interests that would be required for public-private partnership funding, in the long run, that would benefit everybody, because it becomes easier to stratify people for entry into clinical trials. It becomes easier to follow up for long-term safety outcomes, for effectiveness outcomes, and so on. And the investments that I see are not that broad. It's as if the outlook is still a bit shorter term, because within 5 years in European funding structure, you need to have your almost measurable deliverables and so on. And I'm not sure how much interest there is from, well, but maybe, so that maybe in a future public-private partnership funding structure, there would be more appetite for really investing in those areas. And perhaps where there are existing electronic health records or electronic health systems in place, that might be more difficult than in areas where there's nothing yet. And there you can maybe make an incremental step change, put something really innovative in place there, and use that as a...
Okay, Luke, brief comment from you. Oh,
yeah. In short, yes. I mean, getting a truly portable healthcare record, that would be a key enabler, I think, for faster progress. But it's again the problem of cottage industry. How many different companies are going to develop this and try to push their product for good reason because they feel they have the innovation and all that? Well, as with the other measures, I would say let's test them in the same platform, see how well they do, and pick the winner.
Yeah. And I think what is important is the evolution of the culture. What you mean is it's not so broad as an investment, but now it's broad because you have to educate everybody to convince them that this will be very useful. And when everybody will have understood that means that it has found some interest point in all that revolutions, things will go much more smoother. And we need to move toward this new culture with the students, with the physicians, with the patients, with everybody.
Totally agree. I mean, it's a very important aspect. It's a question of sequence, and now it's a technology, and use the technology on the spot, and maybe start in a disease longitudinal observations. But already now, for the technology development, we use a lot of information about what healthy data give us. So in future, I'm totally convinced. I mean, the next step then is, once we have this technology in place, yeah, let's apply exactly the same technology also to healthy people and track them over time. And we also certainly can learn a lot out of the information.
Okay, thank you very much to our panel. And I note that the European Reference Network for Severe Asthma is led by a Brit, and heaven knows what is happening to European reference networks for the future. So, and if anyone else comes up to me and says, what's happening about Brexit? We have no idea. We have no idea. Just know, all of you, that at least 48% of us, at least 48% of us are entirely with you and desperate not to leave. And on that, let's break for tea.